Hey guys, welcome to the Tetra Health and Performance Podcast. Today we're talking strength and conditioning, more that conditioning aspect today, and how to go about it. The why behind it, why we want to do it, how to structure it, how to build it into your programming, why it benefits you, and kind of just the nuts and guts of conditioning. And another sexy word that goes attached to it, energy system training, or conditioning, or respiratory training, goes by a lot of words. Today we're going to just call it conditioning, and we'll explore a bit of the backbone of it and how it works.
Cool. Like everything we do is in some way conditioning. It's aerobically driven. Everything we do all day long, we need our energy systems in play to just power our movements, if you like. And in the gym is obviously no different. Is in the gym's the perfect place to develop them, as well as outside of the gym can be an amazing place to develop them as well for your daily life or for your sport. And if we just quickly go to like the World Health Organization's um, what they believe to be the right requirements for kind of fitness and health. Well, they actually recommend 150. So for ages 18 to 64, they recommend at least 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity exercise per week, and that's a fair bit, right? And or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic physical activity. So that's quite high. And that was the ages 18 to 64. And what I really love was when reading this, and this is the new information, this is 2022 um, article, and they for ages 65 years and above, they say same as for adults of 18 to 64. So you should never stop training your aerobic, your them kind of qualities of conditioning and fitness all the way through to the rest of your life. Something we actually had a really interesting, and we're going to have to shout out Callan, who can't be with us today, but something we had a really interesting conversation with him earlier where we kind of discussed that actually the gait speed of the Grim Reaper, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. And there's a certain speed, obviously, a certain aerobic capacity that you need to have to be able to outwalk and outspeed the Grim Reaper behind you.
Be death himself.
Yeah.
You touched on something just earlier, James. Like, not all this has to be in the gym, and like the most important thing with this aerobic qualities is if you're going to do it for every day or every week in your life going forward, it has to be something you enjoy. And this can come in many forms, from a moderate to vigorous intensity. It could be you play a sport on the weekend, and how great to see that from like adolescence into middle age, and then into maturing into a mature adult, still playing sport. Fantastic way to get that aerobic qualities in. Going for a walk, going for a hike, ride your bike, playing with your kids, taking the dog for a walk. This comes in many different forms. Getting that heart rate up to a certain point for moderate and a little bit higher for that vigorous point. But doing something that you enjoy and that is sustainable and you just like doing, that's part of the journey of trying to find out what works for you and your fitness and your lifestyle. And it's different for everyone.
Yeah, it's so important. It's like for myself, like playing a soccer game or football game that lasts 90 minutes. That's an hour and a half of physical activity there, and it won't feel like a bludge. It's kind of like you're chasing after a ball. It can feel quite easy to do. So it's adding them things in outside of your like maybe your gym training can be extremely beneficial and doesn't feel like you're actually working, which is incredible, right? And it's something that maybe will either have more longevity to it before you get bored of it and over it. And then when it comes to fitness training, that was kind of a shout out to everyone outside of the gym, everyone who's listening, that you can get it done anywhere. It doesn't have to be in the gym. The gym can be a really good organized place to do it where you can kind of like have progressive overload. But just a shout out to trainers, it's like any idiot can make another idiot tired, throw
Hmm.
up, or sweat. It is maybe the easiest thing to do with training. It's probably why it's like a low barrier of entry for education when you have trainers to just say, okay, well, this is how we train here. We just make everyone work as hard as physically possible, and we make them work so hard that they are sweating, they're completely out of breath, they're completely messed up, and we're exhausting them as much as possible. And it's a very easy thing to do as a coach.
And unfortunately, I think the common consensus of a session is, "Oh, I'm buggered, so it must have done me benefit," or "Oh, I'm sore, it must have done me benefit." There might be small grains in truth in that, but mainly not. As James just said, like a structured effort that slowly layers you, progressive overload. That's kind of how it wants to be played. Just doing random like bullshit go and just smashing that person until they're sweating and puking is negligent. And it's that return on that person wanting to come back and enjoying it, all those extra things. It's not taken into account, and I think it's quite negligent as a coach to just be running constant intensity on an individual.
Exactly. And if it say for example it is a good amount of conditioning for yourself to improve on, Well, most of the time you'll find that all it is conditioning. You're only getting like one benefit. Well, you could be doing certain exercises that you get better technique at, while you could be building some
Mm.
strength and could be building some hypertrophy. You could be getting more than one thing at a time from the training session. But as well as that, then where is the progression? Like if you're always hitting the ceiling, then how are you going to recover to then be able to go again? And where is your progression with that type of training? And one other thing as well is that when we overshoot all the time, what you'll tend to find is too much of your energy then has to go to recovery, so not enough energy can go to adaptation. So we want a certain amount of stimulus so we can adapt to then be able to train again. And if we overshoot all the time, it might not happen today, it might not happen tomorrow, but as eventually we're going to be exhausted and we're going to lose the ability to perform.
Slightly off topic here, but still on. I think this gets, unfortunately, like through mainstream media, like right, the Biggest Loser and that sort of stuff. I think that's what people expect. And I think it carries a lot of fear and anxiety behind it. Like, oh God, I've got to go through this torturous barrage of intensity because that's what training is. And it ain't. Someone that knows the stuff is going to find that right level for you and slowly skill you up, like James just said, with movement, with tempo, with load, with speed. There's a heap of ways to slowly progress things up.
And like with that kind of like that picture that you envision with maybe a boot camp trainer or that kind of Biggest Loser type trainer,
Mm.
we have a name. We sometimes call them whiteboard trainers. It's kind of when there is no progression or plan to the session. It is just a bunch of exercise written up. Normally, you will see it as in burpees times 50, squat jumps times 20, and you'll see these random numbers that, well, in some cases, I'm sure that there's a plan behind it, but in other cases, it is just random nonsense on a board that has no plan outside of what that session is that day.
One size fits all.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
one session to rule them all.
So a little bit off the point, off that there, we'll go into a little bit about energy systems. So when we're talking about energy system training, which is kind of maybe the more complex name for it, the reason we call it energy system training is because we kind of understand that there is different energy systems. When it comes to energy systems, there's two different types. There's the anaerobic. Anaerobic just means without oxygen, and aerobic, which means kind of with oxygen. And the idea of the anaerobic has two different types of energy systems. One is we call it your ATP phosphocreatine system, which is actually mostly what is already in your muscles and ready to go. And then a little bit on the side that is ready to bond with some creatine and make another energy cell to then go again. So that doesn't last long, right? We actually used to think it lasted less, but it kind of would last a little bit longer. We have a little bit more of that than we used to believe, but it doesn't last long no matter what. And this is why when we talk about anaerobic training, it's normally like you picture your Usain Bolt sprinting 100 meters. Well, that's going to be your anaerobic work. You can picture like a strongman, powerlifter. Well, most of that's going to be your anaerobic work. That's going to be you utilizing what is already in the cells and ready to fire up and go. In the background of that, you have and as well as that, another anaerobic system. And this is a little bit slower. But it comes into play when you've utilized them initial ATP that you have in your muscle system, is your glycolytic system. So this is where we break down sugars, and we break down sugars for more energy to then create more ATP to then go again. And that's happening again in the background. Well, they're all in the background at all times, but this is kind of like a little bit extra to then refuel what we had initially. And then after that, last to come to play or last to really get involved is kind of the aerobic system. Again, the aerobic system is always in play, but it's kind of that one that once we've used what we have, we're then going to create more from the aerobic. And while the aerobic system is actually the most that can actually create the most energy possible, it's just a little bit slow on the uptake to make the energy. But once it does, it can really, really fuel. And you can think of this as sports, right? You look at a 100-meter sprinter. Well, when they're sprinting as fast as physically possible, they can't maintain that for long. And the faster you can go, the less you're going to be able to maintain it for. But then you look at a marathon runner, or just humans in general. We can run for very, very, very long extended periods because we can continuously use that kind of aerobic system to develop energy in the background. Um, what I think is super interesting on that, just going a little bit sciencey for a second, is the glycolytic system. So the system that where we utilize sugars has a big byproducts. And just myth busting quickly is we hear people say like lactic acid. I've got lactic acid in my muscles, and this is what's burning. Well, first off, lactic acid in your muscles will probably burn through the muscle, so it's lactate. I think the only place that you might have lactic acid might be in the gut, but the lactate is still, again, it's not the thing to blame. Lactate is actually created as a byproduct of the sugar being used as energy. and then it's actually then shuttled around the body to create more energy. It's more so the byproduct hydrogen, which actually causes the burn in the body. So it's and then your ability over time, hydrogen being, as we know quite well, being like being heat, as that when I actually have too much hydrogen in my body will overheat, and then I've got to expend, I've got to get that out, I've got to utilize that. That can go to like, it can go to your heart, it can go to all these different places where we can utilize it for energy. But what you'll find is when we can't get it out fast enough, what happens is that's when we fatigue. And also the reason I think I've mentioned in another podcast is where we actually end up throwing up sometimes when we are unconditioned and not very good at utilizing hydrogen for energy. What actually happens is the body will take that heat and it'll send it to the organs where it will heat up the fluids in your organs and then it'll project them out so that you can then cool yourself down.
That
And
sucks.
yeah, it doesn't just, and like, but it's such a sign of like when someone
Yeah.
is feeling sick from training, it's just a sign of being unconditioned
Yeah.
more than anything. It's like you just need, probably did too much today and you need to have a steady progress to get to where you're at. And one more thing about them energy systems is um, when we look at the anaerobic systems, especially the main one, the fastest one that we use straight away is like the electronic transport chain, where we create that the ATP straight away. Well, that system doesn't have as many moving parts as again the glycolytic system, which has where we use the sugar has more moving parts. And then when we look at the aerobic system, where we utilize more oxygen for energy, that has the most moving parts. And this tells us a lot, right? This tells us kind of a story of that. Well, we can't actually make that many changes to them anaerobic systems, but we can make many different changes and in different ways to the aerobic system. And again, I picture this as that 100-meter sprinter. You got the average 100-meter sprinter at school who's pretty good at it might get like a 15-second 100-meter, but then you got Hussein Bolt who's breaking the 10 seconds. Well, that's only a 6-second difference, right? And that's the best you're going to really get out of human beings, give or take. But then you look at the aerobic system, like your average person who runs a marathon might run it in 4 hours, but then your world's best are going to run it in 2. Well, the gap there is tremendous. So that's why we all hail, all praise the aerobic system, because it's in play with everything you do for your whole life, and it's also one of the most beneficial for health.
And that's low hanging fruit right there, right? You want to affect just the average person's health. Like working that aerobic system is going to have multifactorial benefits, like the ability, like aerobic work, right? And it's like how quick aerobic work can be influenced on someone. It's like a matter of weeks, like 2 weeks, right? Of a couple of aerobic sessions with nice progressive overload can have massive effects on lowering your heart resting heart rate, increasing your HRV, and these things like kind of change the state of your nervous system, like going from more of like someone that's like a quite a high resting heart rate, being able to drop it down to a lower resting heart rate means that system has a little bit more variability in it. It can get into a recoverable state a bit more. Someone's HRV, if they can increase that number, like the interval between heartbeats at your deepest sleep, it's the metric you'd use for HRV. That number starts to increase, that distance increase. That person has more variability is probably the word to use, between being sympathetic, jacked up, and like, oh, I'm stressed, my body's freaking out, to parasympathetic, like I'm chill, I'm relaxed, my body's adaptable, I'm recovering, I'm making adaptation in this state. So working that aerobic system actually increases that ability to switch between those two, which is, I think, massive.
Oh yeah, it's such a big part. It's like, for example, every time I inhale air, I'm gonna have to utilize that oxygen. I'm gonna have to put it into the bloodstream, and then my heart is then gonna have to pump it out. And if I can get better at utilizing that kind of oxygen in and pumping blood around, when what's gonna happen is I have this. We always have these kind of the inferent and efferent signals that are going on, where my brain is always telling my heart how hard to work, and my heart's working hard, so it's telling my brain where to be. Right. So if I actually get better at my fitness, what actually happens when my heart doesn't have to actually work quite as hard, which we measure as in like beats per minute when you're training or your resting heart rate. Well, my heart is then going to tell my brain by beating less. It's like, oh, we don't have to be so jacked up, and we don't have to use all these hormones and like that are going to like adrenaline, like norepinephrine, all these hormones that are going to spike up your nervous system. So it's always with the body and the brain being kind of like two separate things but very entwined. It's always like a communication going backwards and forwards between the two. And something like Mitch saying, just like getting your fitness better is going to change the way that you perceive things through your autonomic nervous systems by being like let more parasympathetic. And just for some background information, parasympathetic is one of what we call your rest and digest. It's when the body is healing itself. And then we have that kind of sympathetic, we call it fight and flight. So it's when you're actually more like you're ready to go. The body is utilizing energy, and it's picking up heart rates, it's picking things up, it's ready to move. And there's a time and place for both. Like neither one is better than the other, but we find a lot from people just in general is they're too like our daily stresses are so high now. Like the
Mhm.
only stresses that we probably are designed to handle is like lack of foods and predators. From either social environments or out in the wilderness. And then these days, our stressors follow us home. They
Mm.
are during the day, all day at work. They are like thinking about work at night, or whether it's work, it's family, it's whatever it may be. It's financial. All these things are stressing us out all the time. And well, building up your aerobic system is like putting savings in the bank account for when these stresses do have. It's limiting the amount of stress that you're going to have in that moment, and it's going to limit how you can, and it's going to control how you can handle it.
I also think like that bucket analogy works here as well in a
Right.
slightly different way. Like obviously stress coming in, I need things to relieve stress to go out. You know what also works? A bigger bucket. And that's what that increase or decrease of resting heart rate and increase of HRV will do. You get a bigger bucket, baby. You can handle more stress, and you can kind of switch on and off at an easier rate and kind of play where you want to go. So if you have the ability to down regulate yourself with your breathing or like having a good aerobic base, and you can influence your nervous system to drop, that's huge. If you're feeling like, oh shit, I notice I'm stressing, I'm like really feeling it, man, some breathe in, relax, calm the nervous system down. You are more likely to be able to influence that nervous system into a point of recovery and de-stress, which is massive. All hail the aerobic system.
Yeah. Yes, the aerobic system are massively in play all the time, and with the aerobic system, there's actually the powerhouse of the cell, which is mitochondria, that, which is the energy system of it's what creates the aerobic respiration, so the ability to transfer energy and create it in the cell. So mitochondria is so important. It fuels every action, it fuels everything in the body, right? With every single cell. So cells in the brain, liver, muscles, even your nervous system firing. It's kind of like our body's energy currency. It's the main currency not only in the cells but in all forms of life and in the planet. Yeah, all cells make it, and they use it nearly with all their processes. So it's so important. And the kind of the mitochondria is that I like the kind of information that they've looked into how it began, and maybe mitochondria actually hasn't actually changed that much in our life in evolution, and how at the beginning of time there would have been like a very simple cell, and that cell then ended up eating a mitochondria, and then our bodies had like a were symbiotic together, where now to this day we live with mitochondria inside us as like an alien form in some way.
Hybrid, baby. Dude,
Yeah.
I always just get confused where the mitochondria and midichlorians from Star Wars.
Yeah,
Like,
but I
it's the
reckon,
same.
yeah, but very, very much, yeah. Well, that's probably where it came from, right?
I don't know,
I
mate.
would, I would have thought so.
It's the
I thought,
same, right?
yeah, and the cool thing is there was two different types of mitochondria. Well, you can kind of imagine, well, one mitochondria that could harness energy from oxygen, and then the kind of opposite the difference in the world is that we have plants as well, and they have mitochondria that can harness energy from kind of more CO2, and we expel obviously that CO2. We utilize more oxygen, and they in turn utilize the CO2 and expel more of the oxygen.
They can use the force.
Yeah, 100%.
Friends.
So, and yeah, so with that being said, like mitochondria is super important. It only actually takes 14 days. So mitochondria being the energy of life, really, it only takes about 14 days of training before people see like your mitochondria are way more efficient, and you actually can double your amount of mitochondria that you have in the body pretty easily, creating more cells. And the way I see it is, if as our body dies and our cells start dying, well, one of the best things to keep us alive and well is just to have as many cells as possible, and as many of them cells being as healthy as possible. So again, coming back to cardio training and aerobics, the aerobic system, it's super important to keep you living for as long as possible and keep you as healthy as possible.
Again, all hail the aerobic system.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
comes in play. Like these are two of the most impactful things, like to regulate your nervous system from like a stress and de-stress situation to like longevity and just having energy in the bank and be able to do stuff for a long period of time, hopefully the rest of your life. Cardio is fantastic, and it gets bashed on a bit for shits and giggles, but it's a necessity. It's a necessity to keep yourself fit and healthy, e.g., strength and conditioning.
And kind of as we were just discussing a second ago, where we have these kind of whiteboard trainers and all these different types of kind of like just conditioning training, which is just about thrashing someone. Well, energy system training is not dissimilar to strength training, and the kind of the principles that we follow when we train, which are specificity and progressive overload. We want to see where the individual is at, and then we want to give the right dose to that individual depending on where the individual is at in their life, and like any illnesses they may have, their age, their previous exercise history, and so on. And then we want to dose appropriately to that individual, and then we want that progressive overload where we are slowly giving them more and more in the direction that we want, and we want the specificity. So we want to actually be like, okay, well, the cool thing about knowing about them energy systems is let's target a specific energy system for a while, knowing that the others are in the background, but we may have a specific goal to achieve. It may be a sport, yeah, it could be like MMA, it could be more aerobic sport, it could all these different things. It could be a long distance runner, easy. It could be like a short distance runner, and then we want to develop the energy systems accordingly with them two kind of principles in play.
Cool. In specificity, like your body will adapt in one way, especially if you're hyper specialized. An easy one, we've already painted the picture around a couple of times already, but like a sprinter, for example, like that 100-meter sprinter that's working to shave that 5-6 seconds off for their whole goddamn life as an adult or an adolescent, their body will adapt into being really good at that. Probably not as great with the other things. So like hyper specializing in those like anaerobic qualities, being explosive and powerful and just firing all that energy as quick as you can to be as explosive as possible. Your body will adapt in that, and you probably won't be as great as longer distance stuff. Picture like Usain Bolt can slay the 100-meter, but he's probably not going to be breaking records in a marathon, right? His body's probably going to go, holy shit, like 20 minutes through and go, I'm absolutely hurting in every single fucking way I can. But that's being hyper specialized in a position, and we do want some sort of specificity, but we do be phasic with it, and we do phase certain qualities in and out when we need to have like a nice diverse range of energy systems at our disposal.
And while you have specificity, you also have like just training energy systems for health. And well, we discussed this in a previous podcast, but we have these kind of type 2 and type 1 muscle fibers. And quite often as we age, the type 2 muscle fibers, which are more like that non-oxidative, explosive, more powerful muscle fibers, well, they dwindle and they disappear off as we get older if they're not utilized. So while aerobic training is really, really important to build up your fitness, to build up your overall tank, you still have to add some of this anaerobic training in, especially when it comes to we see a lot. We see like you heard me say it a couple of times. Well, that anaerobic training of the glycolysis, well, that's breaking down sugars, and well, we want that quite often. We want to have the ability for our body to utilize different things for energy. Yeah, so but we want the ability to use these different energy systems in play just to be healthy and just to utilize the different pathways that our body has for health. So we want this really, really decent aerobic system. And then at the same time, and bear in mind that even in sports, one of the mistakes that people make is, say, for example, I look at soccer as a sport, for example. Well, while it may be that we need to sprint, it's kind of soccer is more like a game where you're going to stop, sprint, stop, sprint, a little bit slow, sprint. Well, there's been a few mistakes made over time with training, and what has happened is, especially in younger age athletes, what they've done first is they've just taken them, they get specialized them straight away. So they've gone, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to get you sprinting, stopping, and what that creates doesn't actually allow the body to change. Yeah, to have a higher output for them sprints, because we need certain different attributes. When we're sprinting, it's kind of the ability for the heart to take in a small amount of blood and then pump that blood out really hard. Well, when we're actually doing more aerobic work, what is the ability for the heart to fill up even more and then pump more blood out. And what we've tend to see is that actually like athletes have been undertrained with allowing that eccentric phase of the heart to work to take in more blood, then push it out, rather than that the heart gets really, really strong and not elastic enough, and it pumps out blood too fast, too quickly, and doesn't have the other kind of specifications. And when we look at training with soccer as well, and nearly all sports, we have this thing called, and it's popularized by, I think it was Joel Jameson. It's called dynamic energy control. And the cool thing about dynamic energy control is it instantly paints a picture of who's going to win. Well, say for example, I have this aerobic system, energy system, which can really, really well develop energy really efficiently, and it can put a lot of energy out there. Then I have my glycolytic and I have my phosphocreatine energy systems. Well, they can put out energy once they've been used very explosively, very fast, but then once they've used, they're not working anymore, and it's very hard to recover from. Well, you can kind of think of the player that can work at the highest amount and not need to recover. Yeah, so they can stay in their aerobic system as for as long as possible without going out of it, where they're going to have to take time to stop to recover. Well, they're going to be the best player on the field because they're going to, for certain sports and certain positions, they're going to be the guy that can continuously move. Yeah, so it's training that aerobic system to such a high level that you're actually out competing someone who's in their glycolytic or their anaerobic systems, and you're still in your aerobic system and you're going, okay, this is easy. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of training, but it's super beneficial.
And you can use like technology here to help you out to know where you're at as well. Like simply, like I think most people will have some sort of a device, like whether it be like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit or something of that nature, that shows you where your heart rate's at, and you can kind of use that heart rate to kind of bracket where your aerobic outputs are at. So like something like pretty low, right? Like that 120 to 150 kind of zone will generally put you in that zone to eccentrically hypertrophy the heart the way it needs to be for that aerobic development. And that's a cool way. You just work within those thresholds and you kind of just teeter on, but don't go over, don't go under. And off memories, like something like 30 minutes continuous in that zone will give you some decent stim.
Yeah, I think that's probably like what you're shooting for, kind of minimum. Like with 30 minutes, kind of at least 30 minutes of that kind of 120. Obviously, less might be best for someone starting off, but eventually we want to be like, we're about, okay, let's dose about 30 minutes and let's work that up. Let's get that higher and higher. Let's see if this person can, because we find quite a lot of people when they first start aerobic training, it's actually quite hard for them, even at a low intensity, to stay below that kind of 150 mark, and they peak quite quickly. And that's where that kind of control comes in as well. Can they actually keep working but maintain that lower heart rate all the way through?
Skill set, definitely.
Yeah, and I think with training, quite often we talk about again these whiteboard trainings and this training. There's a company called MyZone that we like the idea of it, where we can kind of track our members' heart rates while they train. But the issue with MyZone is it gives too many points to being in such a high heart rate all the time, when most training is not going to be that beneficial always being in the high heart rate. When we're, like Mitch just said, like we got that kind of 120 to 150 range, that's going to be amazing for aerobic. And if I'm always working for the higher end heart rates, well, I'm not going to develop the aerobic system enough. And then, as well as that, is one of the other main benefits of working in higher heart rates is the ability to recover from the high heart rates. So if I'm going to go into a high heart rate, I don't want to stay there for too long. So I don't want to accrue time up there. I want to work there, work really hard, and then try and come back down, go back up, and I can really develop my ability to recover from stresses with that type of
Yeah.
training. That's why high intensity interval training has been so popularized. HIIT training.
Yeah, man, and that keep going on that my zone just quickly. Unfortunately, that thing gives you points for where you spend your heart rate. It gamifies you to constantly be in the highest zone because that's where you get the most points, and you win bloody whatever member of the month or whatever it happens to be. Again, it just comes out of that's not where the specificity of where the development needs to be for whatever energy system we're working on. If we do need to work in that high heart rate zone, it's generally very brief. It's like a lot of output, very short, and then with moderate to high recovery, and then repeated for whatever efforts. And if we're working like that, aerobic quality is generally pretty low sustained for a decent amount of time. So just constantly be just thrashing yourself at a continuous output. It just doesn't play to how the systems need to be developed. And I don't really agree with the mental toughness element of it either, or anything of that nature. So I don't really see a strong argument for it.
And when we're looking at these heart rate zones as well, there's more than one way than just getting on a bike or just doing burpees. And there's tons of different ways, even in strength training, or hypertrophy training, resistance training, where we can get these same kind of benefits. And you see it often in programming, right? Well, when I'm performing a one exercise on its own, well, with a long recovery, well, that's going to be probably the lowest heart rate that I'm going to get from from an exercise. It could be 1 rep, 2 reps, 3 reps, and then I'm going to rest for 2 to 3 minutes. Well, that's going to have an effect on your aerobic system, but that very small effect. I'm sorry, your anaerobic system, but that very small effect. So we can program accordingly to get these benefits without even having to use cardio equipment. We can use things like supersets, trisets, I think like mega sets, I think they're called, when it's like 5, 6 exercises, circuits. Um, like we can program high reps. We can program like shorter recovery times to still get these really big benefits from our conditioning. And this is also somewhere that you find probably your long distance runners don't do enough of. But rather than just hit the pavement and get this very repetitive strain, they could be in the gym building some muscle, doing these larger circuits to develop their fitness and strength at the same time.
Your body doesn't sit on a bike and go, "Oh, I'm doing cardio now. This is a bike. It's now cardio training." It just knows that the heart rate's being stimulated in a certain zone, and there's repetitive movement with X amount of force on these muscles for X amount of time. And like James just said, you can mimic that with strength work. And how cool is that? Like you can still be doing cardio and your strength development at the same time. But on that joint perspective, I like using this as jujitsu is kind of one of my hobbies too. And we get a lot of guys asking every now and then, "What should I do?" And sometimes doing more of your sport isn't best, especially if it's like maybe like hard on the joints or like the connective tissues, like running, just hitting the pavement again and again. You can do like strength replacement, or you could do like a non-impact drill to kind of still keep those qualities alive and increased. So sometimes like use jiu-jitsu on the mats, like strangling each other or strangling another person, two people fighting consistently, like doing more of that sometimes might not be better for the cardio, and it has that small risk of injury and that sort of stuff. So get what time you need on the mats or running, whatever it happens to be. If you need to further develop your conditioning qualities, there's other ways to do it. Like we said, strength work, or it could be a non-impact bit of equipment like a bike or a Versi or a rower or something of that nature, and you can still keep that heart rate in a nice healthy zone and develop those aerobic qualities without doing much wear and tear on the old body.
Yeah, I've even programmed before with so long distance runners, for example. I've programmed them blocks and or days where they're not just running in a straight line. So rather than them getting out running 6 kilometers and everything's on the pavement and running in a straight line, I've programmed them actually doing like side steps and backwards running and sideways running, lateral running, uphill running, downhill running, on top of their training program to give them that variability in their training where they're developing different muscles and they're dropping that repetitive motion of continuously hitting the pavement with high impact and running linearly. And it can make a massive difference. That doesn't have to be just in the gym, but like you definitely want to be, especially if you're looking at your training going, okay, well, I need to develop if for a runner, for example, I need to develop my pace, my speed, my aerobic system. Well, that can be your aerobic system training on the side, like actually giving yourself some different movement.
Cool. On that slightly a bit more too, it's a topic I want to talk about earlier, but I kind of just missed the mark. For those that are like, "Oh, cool, this sounds great. I want to get into this," and maybe I've been neglecting my energy system training, and I want to get into some running. Just like everything, just phase it in slowly. We don't want to go straight jumping up to a run volume we haven't done in years or we haven't done before, or like anything impact driven. I just use running because it's the most common, right? Like everything, you phase it in slowly. You might want to start off with something that's like we just said, really non-joint specific, like maybe running on grass, for example, would be really cool for like I don't know a smaller distance at a lower output, where you might only be running a total of 2 or 3K, random numbers by the way, and then you slowly build it up and you transition onto the road and you slowly creep those numbers up over weeks to months. So I think one of the most common injuries we hear about is people like, especially lockdown, right? We chatted to the physio podcast, the injury one, like the rate of bloody ankle, knee, and hip injuries for all the people that suddenly became runners through lockdown that went from nothing to moderate to high volumes of total running. So like, I know there's now joint specific and all that sort of stuff, but it's also related to the energy system development as well. It wants to be slowly built up, and you got to know where you're at, and then just take a step back, and then slowly build from there. Probably the best bit of advice I can give you to slowly
Yeah, and
kind of get where you need to go.
I think using a undulated training program is a super important, especially for runners, where you perform a high intensity, um, like low volume day. So that could be that you actually like you work on a shorter distance at a higher pace. So you're working on your pacing, you're working on your maybe your higher anaerobic system training, then a kind of like a high volume, low intensity day where I'm going to go slower pace and I'm going to run a route. I'm going to challenge myself for distance, a bit more of that kind of aerobic system day. And then a bit of a moderate intensity, moderate volume day where you're going to hit a little bit of both. And the cool thing about programming like that is it allows your actual training days to be recovery as well from your previous work days. You're going to look at them 2 days, the one where you go really high intensity, the one where you go really high volume. They're going to be the days that you're going to actually have to recover from them sessions because they're going to challenge your system so much. So off the back of that, a couple of things that are really important to look at when you are looking to train your fitness. It's kind of like markers of fitness, things that you can kind of look at to tell that if your fitness training is paying off and is working. And a few of them. A few of my favorites is just your first one, your resting heart rate, which is kind of best way to take your resting heart rate is to take it a few times a week. Yeah, and take it first thing in the morning when you're most relaxed. And if you can't take it first thing in the morning, you can take it at some point in your day, when you've had at least 5 to 10 minutes to sit down before you take it. With trying to be in the least stressful situation you can. Take the average from the 3 to 4 times, and that would be your resting heart rate. So you're counting your beats per minute. Yep. And then you're taking that as your resting heart rate. And ideally, we want to see nice low resting rates with most people. And we tend to find the general population these days, with all the stresses that they have, their resting heart rate becomes really quite high, and higher than you'd expect for what we should have, for as a healthy human. Other ones is your heart rate variability. Or your heart rate variability is you're going to need a piece of technology to measure this. There's plenty of different types. Mitch wears an Aura ring. I've worn a Whoop before. I think all Polars do it now. They pretty much every piece, anything that tracks your heart rate. I know Apple Watches do it now, and like was it Fitbits and all that stuff. They Most of them take your heart rate variability now, and that's the time in between your beats of your heart rate that timed in milliseconds, and then the variability of it. So, for example, my boom is going to be like point 0.3, and then my next boom is point 0.5. Well, actually, the variability, you're healthier if you have these wider, bigger differences between the variation of time of heart rate. Other ones, well, you can have your VO2 max tested and your volume oxygen max. The cool thing about that is that what you're actually doing is you're learning at the highest point that you can utilize oxygen as energy before you utilize these kind of other energy systems. So again, we're talking about the dynamic energy control that can be super useful to understand. And the last one we have, which has a lot of correlation, and we've mentioned it a few times, is your CO2 tolerance. So your tolerance to carbon dioxide. Sorry, yeah.
Say learn to breathe out, guys, and then have and be okay with those retentions. It's not just a reflector of just of cardio, but kind of whole body, whole system efforts. Like honestly, it's learn to exhale. Take anything away from today, learn to exhale. It helps out from a biomechanical standpoint, helps out from a nervous system standpoint, helps out from a respiratory standpoint as well. It's a huge game changer.
And yes, because when every time what we tend to find is we have this thing called a negative feedback loop in our body. I was just going to get into CO2 and that CO2 tolerance, because with that heart rate variability, the resting heart rate, and the VO2 max, well, they're all going to be amazing indicators of your fitness and your training. And that CO2 tolerance one, I think, has tons and tons of application to your health and fitness. And what we find is a thing called a BOLT score. A BOLT score is, if I'm sitting down just relaxed, I take an exhale, and after the soft exhale, just normal exhale, after the exhale, I'm going to hold my breath. And when I have the urge, a real hard urge to inhale, or even when I swallow, I'm going to then time that. And I say, for example, it was 15 seconds. Well, for a good BOLT score, you want above 20 seconds, and then even better, above that 25-30 mark. And you find we do this test often when we screen people, and we find it to be very, very low. And that's your ability to handle CO2 in the body. What we find with most people is they actually can't, they've dropped their CO2 tolerance so low that what happens is they create this negative feedback loop in their body. My CO2 is so low, my brain actually doesn't register oxygen, right? So the brain doesn't actually have any receptors to tell how high the oxygen is. It's more likely just to tell how high CO2 is, and it will panic the second too much CO2 is felt in the body, especially if I have a low tolerance to it. So if I have a low tolerance to CO2, when it slightly sneaks above my tolerance, which is probably below what most people should have as a CO2 tolerance, my brain will tell me to inhale. Yeah, once I inhale, I take oxygen in. But the problem is because I have such a low CO2 tolerance, I need oxygen, yep, to diffuse into my cells, but it will only diffuse into my cells if I have enough CO2 in that cell. Therefore, again, I have too much CO2 again, my brain tells me to inhale, and I create this negative loop where I can no longer take enough oxygen in because I have such a low tolerance to CO2. Mitch just saying there that how important an exhale is. Well, the exhales and holding of breath could be the only things that can break that loop and make you healthier. When I actually have the ability to take nice long exhales, I have to slowly train my body to have a higher CO2 tolerance. When I have a higher CO2 tolerance, I hold on to more CO2 inside my cell. Therefore, I'm better at taking in oxygen. So therefore, I have more CO2 in my cell. When oxygen comes to the cell, it gets diffused into the cell. I hold more oxygen. Therefore, I don't actually have to breathe in as much.
Beautifully explained, mate.
Was it?
That was good. That
I
was
don't know.
good. I thought that was good. And honestly, you can do like listening to this right now. You can just sit down in a relaxing place, a relaxing environment, take a breath in, take a breath out, do it again, do it again. At the end of that exhale, when you've had that full exhale, it's just a retention. And boom, stopwatch, go. And then as soon as your body goes, oh shit, I need another breath in, and you're not trying to fight it to the nth degree. You're just going, okay, when does my body say I need to breathe in? Boom. What was the interval between that time? As James said, 20's looking pretty cool. That's awesome. That's like the baseline of like, yeah, we're doing all right. If you're last and under double digits, or like you're really struggling, you might need to be working some aerobic qualities as well as like learning how to exhale and manage those internal pressures there.
Yeah, and I feel like the weird thing about humans is that we were never developed to be so sedentary, so that we actually have nothing in our brain or body that would ever be like, oh, we don't need any receptors for oxygen because it would never be a situation because we're going to be using oxygen. But now the situation has become that we become so sedentary that we need these new things, these new things to do. We have to go to a gym. We have to train. We have to change our lifestyles to actually be kind of better than we are allowing ourselves to be in a sense. And with kind of what Mitch just said, then you have you can just practice your exhales, which is something that's so not natural. Like you have to actually go out of your way to now build yourself back up. And we do something in the gym where we do hypoxic sprints. We do actually we stimulate like altitude training, and we stimulate like kind of what happens when you swim by doing an exhale and getting your air out and then sprinting with a breath hold, which does the exact same thing as what I just mentioned. It allows you to build up your CO2 tolerance. It allows you to build up your CO2 tolerance, which actually allows you to utilize more oxygen, which massively increases your ability to recover and like repeat sprints, repeat exercise, and recover as fast as possible.
And I'm going to take like 10 steps back here. Like I love strength. I love strength. I love strength so much. I love lifting heavy shit. It's fun as hell. But like the conditioning element is sorely missed out on, and the amount of benefits it has to multi efforts of our system and how we operate as human beings and what we can and cannot handle, I think is severely underrated. And good cardio, like energy system work, conditioning, whatever you want to call it, phased in and out for an individual is not just making them fitter, it is making them more pliable, more resilient as an individual. I think they're some of the best tools that we can help elicit and build in just anyone, right? It doesn't matter if you're an athlete to bloody you're 65 years old and you don't do much movement. Like these are all beautiful things to work in. You're going to get massive effects on it. It's going to make your quality of life so much better, being able to get these heart rates to pick up and sustain and maintain these energy productions and work these inhales and exhales. It's freaking huge and massively underrated. So, like, shout out to the aerobic system, shout out to bloody cardio. Well done.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mitch. Like when if I'm not running after kind of like a football, and I'm kind of not a big fan of cardio training myself, and I don't make myself do it probably as much as I should at some stages. And I go through phases where actually over the last few years I've seen more benefit probably as I've got older. So therefore now I'm actually making myself run, and I'm going out doing runs, like getting on the bike, doing sprints, doing things like them hypoxic sprints as well. Um, but I find that probably not enough people enjoy it. And the sad thing is it's definitely a catalyst to enjoying your strength training more and allowing yourself to strength train it further into the future and getting more benefits. We spoke about it before. It's like you want to build big legs. Well, you've got to have a big energy system development to do that. Like you're gonna work your like everyone's done it. We've done lunges before, and I've said these near the exact same thing, but I'm gonna repeat it again. We've done lunge. You do lunges. You're using some decent weight, and you know it's not the quads that are giving in. Your heart rate's giving in,
Mhm.
and you think just a bit of energy development on the side is gonna maybe stop the limiter from being your cardiovascular system and making the limiter be the actual muscles, so your muscles can then achieve the growth that they need and the stimulus that they need to grow.
Yeah, even the biggest strength diehard can kind of concede the benefit
Yeah.
of cardio. Like I'm speaking to you powerlifters out there. I know you're listening. So I remember like when I was younger, it was all about strength. It'd be like, you just shit on cardio. Like, it's cardio is anything more than 5 reps.
And the information has been so bad out for a long time, right? Where it's just been demonized to do any cardio when you are doing strength. And while there is this thing called the interference effect, we've discussed this between myself and Mitch. The interference effect is not so great that doing some cardio Yeah, especially if you need the cardio. If your base level of fitness is so low, well, you're going to get way more strength gains from the cardio than you may believe as well.
And you can phase it in or out. Like you don't have to be doing it in competition time, like 2 weeks out of lifting. I'm not telling you to start a cardio program then. No, when you're out of season, when it's like just it's your fun time to play around, experiment. Great time to integrate some aerobic development, and it's going to give you some like a bigger lung capacity to take on more training volume, and you'll have a higher recoverable volume as well. So guess what? You can train more. So
Yeah,
now you can get stronger.
and just
Fantastic.
your day-to-day life, like your attitude from stresses at work will improve, especially with the CO2 tolerance stuff. Like building up your CO2 tolerance will allow you to handle stress so much better at such a higher level. But it also will allow you to just have more energy throughout the day to play with your kids, to do whatever work that you have to do, like gardening and so on, and just live a better life, better at your sport, all that stuff. Just so one more thing about CO2 tolerance, like, and just your tolerance to CO2. Something that's really interesting as well is that when your brain perceives high CO2 from, like, if you think about when you get stressed, what's the first thing you do? You kind of hyperventilate a little bit. You take too much oxygen in, and that's why you get more and more and more stressed as you go. And that's pretty much the reason why they get people to put a paper bag over their mouth when they're stressed, is so that they can actually stop themselves from just taking in too much oxygen and depleting too much CO2 until they hyperventilate. Well, actually, brain tests have been done on the brain with people without an amygdala. An amygdala is the part of your brain that responds to fear. So people that have had either disease that has destroyed their amygdala or injuries that have destroyed the amygdala can no longer experience fear. So what they do is they try and get them to have a panic attack and see how they can stimulate that panic attack without the amygdala. And the only way to do it is to actually juice them up with tons of CO2. So you can imagine that with these low CO2 tolerances that we have day to day, how we handle our life so differently. If we're not doing cardio training and improving it, then everything becomes a stressor. Where maybe if we had a different perception because we had a higher CO2 tolerance, then things might not stress us out so much.
Oh yeah, man. And to go like start of the day too, do what's fun. Doesn't have to be in here on the bike or slaying weights. I think there's so many social benefits to doing a team sport and mingling with people and having a laugh, and also doing conditioning work. I think that's like the where cardio should honestly, personally be doing something that's fun with other people, out in nature, having a great
Out in
time.
nature for me is such
Like
a big deal. I think
getting
it's
some
so
sun
lovely.
on the body, all that sort of stuff. And again, if that's unachievable or whatever it happens to be, then we can mimic it in the gym and we can replicate it. That's cool. But like real life world scenarios, like playing sport and mucking around and being an idiot and all that sort of stuff, that's the best place to get this stimulus. I know it's a bit more crazy, it's harder to track and progressively overload, but I think that's more sustainable because of just the fun element and the social element of it.
Yeah, and we've discussed it as well. Like just getting your daily steps up can be
Mm.
such a big deal. Like when we mentioned what the WHO's recommendations are, one that I didn't mention was they say people should limit the amount of time spent being sedentary. And we all know that actually training for 1 hour in the gym is not going to compete over being sedentary for the other 23 hours. We have to make sure that we're getting up and we're moving the body around as often as possible. Really, I know it's easier said than done, especially for myself and Mitch, who don't have, we're lucky enough to have active jobs.
Mm.
But really, you should be getting up every hour and just having like a minute walk around just to move your legs again, pump blood around the body again, oxygenate your body again, like actually get tissues moving. So you have a healthier lifestyle and you have less of these little inflammatories in your body. It's super important. But
Want to do the passive versus active cool down? I think we've hit that yet.
yeah, this is as I discussed earlier in the podcast at the beginning, I kind of discussed how lactic or actually lactate acid, um, lactate or just lactate is actually not as bad as people always believed to be. It was very much people would be like, oh, my legs are burning. It's the lactic acid that's burning. Well, it's not. It's the buildup of hydrogen and what the poor when studies were done, they'd look at the lactate and they'd measure it, and then therefore, because that was high, they'd actually believe that was the reason for the muscle hurting, for nausea, for fatigue, and all that stuff. But actually, the truth is what that lactate is being created to then be shuttled around the body as another as a more utilizable energy to go back into the glycolytic, to back into the Krebs cycle to be used as energy. Um, but off that, that was the basis. That information was the basis for cooldowns. And I think we've all heard it before about an active cooldown. So after you've gone for your long run, you might then do a short, slow run afterwards. or in gyms and training, coaches were running you through like a slow cool down at the end of the session to buffer lactate. Well, actually, the truth is we don't want to buffer lactate. We want to buffer CO2, as we just discussed so much about CO2 anyway. And the cool thing about that is that actually what we want to do is we want to leave lactate in the body. So when lactate is left in the body to then be utilized, what you'll find is your next training session the day after will be better because you've got the energy storage ready to go. So you've got more sugars ready for energy the next time you train. What you'll find happen, the best thing to actually do after you train is something that we've been doing for 5 years at Benchmark. Sadly, not enough people actually get involved with it sometimes when we put it on the end because it's probably not, it doesn't seem like you're doing too much benefit, but the benefit is massive. So what we do is we lie down on our backs and we do some pranayama breathing where we work on, like Mitch just said earlier, these long exhales and these shorter inhales. But what that actually does is it allows us to buffer our CO2. Yeah, allows us to have a higher CO2 tolerance, but that gives the body time to use the lactate as energy that is stored for the next day's session. So lying on your back, simple breathing is better than an actual active cool down after training for that reason. Did I explain that well enough?
Yeah, I think you get the idea of it too, right? It's huge. Like lying down, chilling out, you're gonna have a greater recoverable rate versus flopping around on a foam roller or doing a lighter intensity effort. Calm down, and just the whole nervous system effort of just closing your eyes as well and being on your back, having your legs elevated or something of that nature. It is all shifting and tilting the spectrum from a sympathetic experience, like we're going hard here effort, into a parasympathetic effort. And honestly, like when the hell do we carve 5 minutes out of our lifestyle to lie down and chill and to down regulate? So I find it also a meditative experience outside of a recoverable experience versus just leaving the gym and like, shit, time for work.
Yeah.
Giving yourself that opportunity just to have a couple of minutes and go, all right, I'm going to cool down here. Like 3, 2, 5, like 4 or 5 minutes would be great. But even just like 2, 3 minutes to go, all right, I'm tilting the scales into this parasympathetic state or this more recoverable state. It's huge.
Yeah, and after you've, say for example, I train 8 a.m. in the morning. Yeah, and after I train, I've got my heart rate up. I'm really stimulated. Hormonally, we know that we kind of like after about an hour of training, sometimes longer, our testosterone starts dropping. Well, our testosterone is our anabolic hormone. It's a hormone that builds us up and creates more muscle and is going to just generally help us heal. And then we have cortisol, which is actually our hormone that's breaking us down. It's more of a catabolic hormone. So we know that after about an hour of training, we have the highest testosterone levels are starting to drop and our cortisol levels are starting to increase. So we're becoming more catabolic. Our body's starting to break ourselves down. Well, catabolic processes, all them processes that Mitch just mentioned, which are your sympathetic processes. These are stress, fight, flight processes. So what we want to do is we want to switch around to allowing our testosterone to settle, our cortisol to drop, so that after we train, we can maintain this kind of like anabolic process where our body is healing and recovering. And if I trained in the morning and I go straight from the gym to, say, for example, rush to work in traffic, I'm going to be super stressed. My cortisol is just going to keep rising. Right? Testosterone is going to drop even lower. I'm going to be more sympathetic. Therefore, I haven't actually got any time yet to recover my body. I'm going to go to work. The work's not many people have unstressful work situations. So again, more cortisol, more stress, no time to recover. Maybe the only time I'm going to get to recover could be 12 hours after that training session, yet where I'm sleeping. And in that process, in that amount of time, I've been mostly catabolic and I haven't had much time to recover. Then my sleep better be good because that's my only time to recover. But if we think about it, if we were to just drop down on the ground for 5 minutes, completely change our perception, set that parasympathetic nervous system in play, then what's actually going to happen is we're actually going to start recovering straight right there. We're going to be more anabolic, more time to build muscle. Yep. And then our perception through the day will be better. Therefore, we don't get so stressed by simple situations. And we get the extra, I think of it like as an extra 10 hours of recovery, which, wow, like most people should be running for that, like grabbing that off the shelves as quick as possible.
Get down, exhale, and chill out.
Simple,
Huge.
simple. It's too simple. That's why people don't do it, I think.
I know. I don't have time for breathing. I'll breathe today. No, you won't. You'll be in a state of inhale and you'll never exhale and you'll constantly be jacked up with your nervous system.
There you go.
Come back and lie down.
Yeah.
They never do.
And they all tie in. All them things that we said, like that resting heart rate ties in. Every time I inhale, well, oxygen comes into my lungs. That oxygen goes in the blood. My heart has to speed up just to pump it around. So everything ties in. But exhale is the opposite. Exhale. Every time I exhale, there's no oxygen coming into my lungs. so my heart slows down. So we talk about how important it is to have a resting heart rate. Well, a low resting heart rate. Well, being more of an exhaler than an inhaler is a way of doing that, and that's why the yogis have had it forever, right? That's why they have pranayama. It's the aim of pranayama is kind of another name for it is box breathing. It's where we work on a shorter inhale, maybe a retention, a hold of breath, a very long exhale, maybe a retention, a hold of breath again, and then back to the inhale. So while I'm holding my breath, I'm pretty much exhaling, yeah, against the closed glottis. While I'm exhaling, I'm actually exhaling. And while I'm holding my breath after an exhale, I'm pretty much exhaling on my closed glottis. So it's like a free exhale to one inhale ratio. And again, CO2 tolerance, all them things that improve from that. This podcast became more of a breathing podcast, but breathing is like that's your respiration, right? That's we talk about cardiovascular respiration. So there you go.
All right. Shout out to exhaling.
Yeah.
Shout out to the aerobic system. Shout out to cardio.
Yeah. Perfect.
All right, guys. Join you. Look forward to next week. Like, subscribe, engage with the content, feed the algorithm, please. All